Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Dragon's Dogma came out all the way back in 2012, and even though it wasn't a massive success like some other Capcom games, it managed to form a cult following over the years. The great action combat system is quite possibly the main reason why so many people love this game. In fact, the director of Dragon's Dogma, Hideaki Itsuno, said that he always thought that RPGs were missing the essence of the combat and action. Hideaki worked on Devil May Cry series, so it's not a huge surprise that Dragon's Dogma had such an amazing combat system. This guy obviously knew what he was doing. I made a couple of videos on the channel about this topic, and I had some high praises for Dragon's Dogma combat system. We had to wait for a very long time to finally get some news about the sequel, and all we have so far is the simple announcement. No gameplay footage, teaser, trailer, nothing like that yet. We could be getting some juicy new info about the game soon, if we assume that Capcom does the same thing for Dragon's Dogma 2, like they did with Devil May Cry 5. They announced that game in June 2018 and released it in March 2019. So that's like less than a year between the announcement and the release date. When it comes to Dragon's Dogma 2, it's been more than 8 months since we got the announcement, so if we apply the same logic here, we could be getting at least a trailer for the game soon, if nothing else. Although that's one specific example and wishful thinking I guess, but it's not that far-fetched if you ask me. One can hope, right? These are just pure speculations, but if we take a look at the major features of the first game, we could try and predict some things about the sequel. Even though the first game was great in general, it was not without its problems. Those problems could be the reason why the game didn't reach a much bigger audience, and I'm pretty sure that Capcom is well aware of that. We could learn a lot about Capcom's philosophy about the game design if we take in consideration their other IPs like Monster Hunter and Devil May Cry. They like to expand and improve their original formula instead of reinventing the wheel like some other big studios. So let's take a look at how Dragon's Dogma 2 could improve upon the original by taking in consideration all the major features of the first game. When I think of Dragon's Dogma, one of the first things that comes to my mind is the monster climbing mechanic. This was so iconic and unique, and I was hoping it was going to be a genre-defining feature for future action RPGs. Well, for AAA RPGs at least with a bigger budget. I thought they're going to adopt the same design philosophy because it just makes sense in my mind. Unfortunately that never happened, and only much later we started seeing something remotely similar in games that are not even released yet. The trailer for Crimson Desert had some Dragon's Dogma vibes when it comes to climbing big monsters, as well as the Awakener game. I made a video about these games in the past, but nothing has happened since then. We don't have any new info, except the fact that Crimson Desert has been delayed indefinitely, and the Awakener has a slightly less awful name. I finished Bleak Faith Forsaken a couple of days ago, and that game had a simple climbing mechanic as well, but it didn't really scratch the Dragon's Dogma itch I had for so many years. There is no doubt in my mind that the Dragon's Dogma 2 is going to take this feature and possibly improve it as much as possible. If you're not familiar with this game, here's essentially how it worked. You could climb any bigger monster with a press of a button as long as you have the stamina. Your character is free to move around the enemy, you can attack or jump and grab the enemy while in the air. The goal was usually to hit some specific weak points on the enemy, and climbing could help you be more precise with this. It was possible to hit those weak points even without climbing on the monster, but it depends on the enemy itself. The boss fights get crazier as you progress through the game. There are some neat tricks you could do as well. For example, one of the ways to remove the helmet of the troll is to climb on his head in order to trigger his next move. He would then try to grab you, and if you reposition your character, he'll instead take his helmet off by accident.
Watch for ranged attacks! Its helmet is off!
They could go nuts with similar tricks for boss fights in the sequel if they work on improving the climbing system. I think the next step would be to have some flying enemies that will take you for a ride while trying to climb on them. Imagine ending up on a totally different location from where you started the fights, because the dragon just took off with you on his back. I don't think this is far-fetched, especially if you consider some footage from the game I mentioned before, the Crimson Desert. I believe that Capcom is more than capable of doing something like this for Dragon's Dogma sequel. For something like this to work, I think the sequel would need to have a much bigger open world. I mean, bigger doesn't necessarily mean better, but considering the way that Dragon's Dogma open world worked, I think it's logical to expect something like this. What I found a bit frustrating when it comes to climbing mechanic is the stamina management. I just think the stamina drain was a bit too aggressive and you constantly have to think about it while climbing the monster. Player's encumbrance played a major role in stamina drain, but I would actually prefer if climbing was not based off stamina in the sequel. They could possibly just make these enemies a little bit more aggressive when they try to shake you off. Most enemies that you can climb in Dragon's Dogma had a rage phase in which they could easily shake you off. So having another limiting factor like stamina drain while climbing is just not so necessary if you ask me. It's possible to see this mechanic being vastly expanded in ways that we can only speculate.
I mean, these are all speculations, but most of the things I mentioned sounds like a very logical and straightforward way to improve the sequel. Climbing on big monsters is a staple of Dragon's Dogma, so I would be very surprised if they just copy and pasted the system from the first game and leave it like that. To sum it up, I expect to see some notable improvements to the climbing system and quite possibly new mechanics in boss fights, which will take the advantage of this feature. They could really go nuts with this feature, especially when it comes to designing flying monsters. If we think of the sequel as more of the same, just bigger and better, I think nothing is stopping them from doing something similar to what it describes. Or even something crazier. I'm trying to have somewhat normal and logical expectations, but there's always a possibility they go wild with the sequel. My guess is they will play it a bit more safe and just try to build upon the existing mechanics, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. Climbing really seemed like a fleshed out feature and not just a gimmick that you would get to do every now and then. Another logical way to expand this feature would be to include climbing system in general. Not just for monster fights, but for exploring the world as well. The majority of open world games nowadays have some sort of a climbing system for exploration, so I think we could expect something similar in the sequel. If we take in consideration that Dragon's Dogma came out in 2012, and no other open world action RPG had a similar climbing feature for fighting monsters, we can only imagine how good it will look in the sequel. Capcom is using Re-Engine for Dragon's Dogma 2, which is known for good optimization, while still being able to produce very good graphical fidelity. So I expect to see very good presentation in Dragon's Dogma 2, with good optimization in general. Dragon's Dogma streamlined some fundamental action RPG features. Stamina was your only resource for every action in the game. Your mage would cast spells by using stamina, warriors and all other vocations use stamina for abilities, climbing on enemies required stamina, as well as for running. You only had to worry about this single resource, but that also came with its own set of problems. I think it worked great when it comes to spells and abilities, but I would be surprised if they kept the same design philosophy for exploring the open world. When you start running, your character would get out of breath pretty fast because of your stamina. The map was pretty big, although it felt bigger than it actually was because you had to explore everything on foot with a very limited stamina bar. More often than not, you would enter the combat with low stamina because you're just running around, and I always found that annoying. I mean, it wasn't terrible, you could easily use some consumables and get it back, but there lies a bigger issue I want to discuss after we finish this topic. Recent open world games that use stamina as a main resource, like Elden Ring, would only consume the stamina when you get in combat, which is a great idea. Otherwise, you could run as long as you want. I'm almost certain that we're going to see something similar in the sequel, or maybe even get a mount system. Your encumbrance affected how much stamina you lose while doing actions like running, which just makes it even more tedious if you ask me. I don't have any issues if your encumbrance affects the combat, like how much stamina your different abilities are using. But when it affects the only method of exploration in the game, which is already flawed by default, I'm almost entirely sure they're going to change this. I'm not opposed to slowing down the speed of your character depending on which armor you're using, but the way that Dragon's Dogma did it was not very good. If we assume that the sequel will have a much bigger open world, we could possibly expect to see mounts, which would change the exploration quite a bit. But if not, I expect to see a more fleshed out or even a streamlined system like no stamina for running and exploring. Same goes for fast travel system, which was kinda annoying in Dragon's Dogma. You had to use these crystals, but it just wasn't that convenient. It's almost like they didn't even want to have a fast travel system, it felt like an afterthought. If the open world in Dragon's Dogma 2 gets a lot bigger, we could definitely expect to see a more straightforward fast travel system, at least from one major location to another.
It's hard to do art alone.
So, we talked about the climbing system, but we haven't mentioned anything about the combat itself. This would be very hard to predict because they could do a bunch of changes or just decide to build upon what they already had in the first game. If we use the same logic that Capcom uses for Monster Hunter series, we're probably going to get something very similar, but just improved. Monster Hunter series has just improved how all the weapons work, with occasionally adding a new weapon as well as some new features. I highly doubt they're going to scrap all the vocations and include something entirely new, but we can probably expect some major changes. The vocations were essentially character classes, but they made the system very flexible, meaning that you could change your class and abilities by just visiting the inn. I won't go in depth about the vocations because, like I said, it's really hard to predict what they're going to do with this system. The thing I'm really wondering about is the dedicated dodge button or the lack of it. Dragon's Dogma had a dodge roll, but only for certain vocations. Considering that pretty much all third-person action RPGs nowadays have a dedicated dodge roll or dash button, I think Dragon's Dogma 2 is going to include this by default, regardless of the vocation you choose. What's interesting about the dodge roll in Dragon's Dogma, he didn't use any stamina for this move. But if they include this in the sequel in the way I just described above, I highly doubt they won't put stamina to act as a main resource. Otherwise, it could be very exploitable. I mentioned before that I had a bigger issue I want to discuss when it comes to consumable items. What I meant by that is the way you heal in Dragon's Dogma. Pausing your game to consume items in the inventory is quite possibly the worst way you can heal in this type of a game. I mean, sure, Dragon's Dogma had hotkeys that you could use, but still, you could open up the inventory anytime and just use a bunch of plants or potions. The reason why I don't like this feature, particularly in Dragon's Dogma, is because of the great action gameplay. I could tolerate this in games like Skyrim, where the combat wasn't that amazing, but when the game is built around a great action combat system, this only makes it worse in my opinion. So I'm hoping they move to another method of healing or just improve the hotbar feature. Maybe just limit the amount of consumable items on the hotbar and remove the option to pause the game in the inventory. By the way, if you're playing on the PC with a controller, you won't be able to use hotbars, which is really annoying. Then we have another feature that was pretty unique, the peons. Peons were basically your followers in Dragon's Dogma, but they worked in a very unique way that we haven't seen before. You get to make your own peon in the beginning of the game with complete customization. You could get 2 more peons to join your party, but you could only customize the peon you've made. In that Dragon's Dogma 2 announcement, Hideaki talked a little bit about this feature and the idea behind it. They wanted to create a single-player RPG, which would kinda give you the feeling like you're playing online. The peons you could recruit to join your party are peons that other players have created in their own game. They would gain experience and some items when you get recruited by other players, which is a pretty cool concept. So this got me thinking if they're going to focus on improving the peon system in the sequel, or maybe even include a proper co-op system with online features. If we consider that Dragon's Dogma Online was a thing, this won't be so hard to imagine. Imagine exploring the sequel and killing huge monsters with a friend or two, it would be truly epic. Although this doesn't mean I wanted to focus entirely on the co-op features, I still want a proper single-player action RPG, and I think that's exactly what we're going to get regardless of the co-op features. The last thing I want to mention is the story. To be honest, I think this was the weakest part of Dragon's Dogma. It wasn't terrible, but I just didn't really care that much about the story in the first game. The characters were not very good for me to care about what happens, and the main story was not that good either. The game had a bunch of side quests which were pretty mindless, but it didn't really matter a lot because the gameplay was so fun. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvements when it comes to quests, dialogue and the story in general. Although Capcom is not exactly known for great storytelling in games, so don't hold your breath.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
And that would sum up my expectations and some speculations about the sequel. Tell me what you expect to see in the sequel, and do you think it's going to be epic? Leave a comment down below.
Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content. If you wanna go a step further, you can always support me on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.